All right, there's all this talk going on about gerrymandering, and you might have thought that the founding fathers would have considered this, right? Because if you're going to create congressional districts, then some parties are going to come along and try to pick the voters as opposed to the voters picking them. Well, they did think about that, even though it wasn't called gerrymandering then. That came along in the early 1800s. A guy named Elbridge Gerry. He was the governor of Massachusetts, ended up being vice president of the United States, by the way. And they had a district in Massachusetts, was like a salamander. So it became gerrymandering or gerrymandering. So the way to get around that was actually incorporated in one of the original amendments proposed to the Constitution. We know the first 10, freedom of speech and all that, became the Bill of Rights. But there was another one that was proposed that the size of the House of Representatives would grow as the population of the United States grew, and that no district would get bigger than 50,000 people. And that stayed in place, at least the concept, up until the early 1900s. And then we froze at around 435, right? That's where we are in the House today. Unfortunately, back then, I think in the early 1900s, the average size of a district was roughly 100,000 people. Now it's 760,000, give or take. So uh, people are no longer in touch. When was the last time you talked to your representative? Maybe never. So the parties are kind of running the show when it comes to the districts. And now they're even picking their voters as opposed to the voters picking them. What would be the solution? Well, one idea is go back and create more districts. And if you did that back to the 50,000 concept, we would have over 6,000 members of Congress. And obviously, you can't do that. But there is an idea called the Wyoming rule, in which you would take the least populated state in the United States, which is Wyoming, and you would make the districts roughly that size. Okay. If you did that, you would have about 150 more members of the House. That's doable, right? Then, at least in concept, the representatives would be more in touch with their constituents, and it would be harder to gerrymander because by the math just becomes a little more difficult for them to play the games again, to pick the voters as opposed to voters picking them. The obstacle, but this doesn't have to be an amendment, by the way. This can be done by an act of Congress. Of course, the president would have to sign it. And the biggest problem is all the parties would probably figure out who's going to gain, who's going to lose. And we're back where we started. The parties are in charge. So the problem is not gerrymandering. The problem is the parties. Have a great day.